This happened about 10 years ago when I lived in Limestone, a small town in Maine. For reference, I lived in a small apartment complex completely surrounded by forest. It was very quiet, and lots of wildlife roamed the fields and forests surrounding the complex. I was 8 years old, lying on the top bunk of my bed, looking out my window. There was a spider that would build her web right outside my window, so I would always watch her build her web at night before I went to sleep. My window overlooked a parking lot that was right next to a field bordering a thick forest. One night, I was watching Mrs. Spider build her web, as I always do, when I see this very tall, ape-like thing with a long, thick tail that tapered at the end, kind of like how you would imagine a T-Rex tail, except hairy, if that's a good comparison, walking across the parking lot. I kept watching as it wandered into a field just before the forest. It then placed itself between two other trees, about arm's length away from each other, and began climbing up by grabbing the two opposite trees with its respective hands and feet, and slowly shimmying up the tree. As it made it to the tops of the trees, it sort of blended in with them and stopped moving, and I couldn't see it anymore. To this day, I am completely stumped as to what I saw from my apartment window. So, I've lived in a quiet, walkable neighborhood for about 1.5 years now. My job is about 10 minutes from my apartment, so I always walk. I'm a chef, so I get out pretty late. First encounter. Walking home and at the crossroad where I turned and I saw a man walking perpendicular to me. The man stopped and looked at me. I was maybe 1 block away. The man then walked behind a telephone pole and completely disappeared. Could have just been me not seeing where he went, but the whole thing gave me an odd feeling. Second encounter. Maybe 6 months later. Same crossroad, same distance, same time of night. This one was way weirder. There was a woman standing on the top of an 8-foot orange A-frame ladder in the middle of the intersection, looking up at the sky, hand over her eyes like she was blocking sunlight. The moment I see her, she slowly comes down off her ladder and picks it up. She started walking away with it, and I followed her as she was walking the same route I take to get home. Slowly, I was catching up to her, but when she took a corner, all of a sudden she was gone. I took the same corner less than 10 seconds after her. There was nowhere she could have put the ladder that quick. Backstory. Towards the tail end of the summer of 2018, my family was house sitting for my cousin in North Carolina. The house itself is very large, so the kitchen living room is right next to the kitchen. Light kitchen can be seen from the living room fully, which had a hallway that wraps around the master bedroom and back down to the living room. Next to the living room was a staircase to the loft, where me and my sister were sleeping. And in the living room, there was a door to a balcony, deck that overlooked the river. It had huge windows that let you see the balcony. On this night, me and my mom stayed up till 1 a.m. watching Law & Order, but went to our rooms around 1. Okay, we were staying for 8 days, and this happened on the 5th night. I could not sleep, because I felt like something was watching me, and at around 4 a.m. I heard a shriek, like nothing I've ever heard before. So an hour later, I decided to see if I could sleep on the couch in the living room. I noticed that I kept hearing paws walk up and down the hallway I mentioned. I go, okay, it's just their cute little dog. Except that she is laying on the other side of the couch, where I see her while the footsteps are going. Then, I hear the most guttural noise I've ever heard. It was like a growl and a scream mixed into one. So at that point, I freeze. I close my eyes and pretend to be asleep. After about 20 minutes, the sun rises. I ain't no idiot, so I run to the kitchen and get the biggest flipping knife there is to look around. Nothing out of the ordinary, except I look out the window onto the balcony. The windows were fogged up as it had been raining last night, and clear as day, written on the window through the condensation, was the word hi. This happened a few years back. It was midwinter, had snowed heavily the day prior, and was cold as hell. I decided to take my husky out to the woods since he loves the snow and the cold weather, and I love the scenery. The trip was uneventful, to say the least. Took our usual trip to a nearby field and started to head back home. But this time, instead of our typical way back, I decided to go off course and go into the denser part of the woods. My intent was to enjoy myself more of the snowy forest, but it quickly took a more sinister path. As we were walking back home, I noticed rabbit snow prints appearing out of a nearby hole in the snow, which stretched for about 10 meters onto a nearby tree. As I got closer, I noticed that the rabbit's trail had disappeared. I looked behind the tree and found that there was human snow prints, barefoot human snow prints. I followed the trail again. Meanwhile, my dog is barking and pulling me in the opposite direction. They looked like the person making them was drunk or had never had feet before. They swerved zigzag-like, probably 30 meters after appearing the human feet, turned into hooves and continued to trail off. Now at this point, I'm scared shitless, confused and unnerved while my dog is next to me, barking and trying to pull me away. I just start booking it back to my house. That's basically it. I just wanted to share it and maybe hear somebody's thoughts about what it could have been. I live in Eastern Europe, so I don't think it could have been a skinwalker. When I was a kid, I lived in a place called Black Hammock Island in Jacksonville, Florida. I always had the curtains in my bedroom open at night to let the natural moonlight in. One night, I was sitting against my closet door, which was opposite my window. The light was off, and I was on my phone. The reason I was sitting there was because there was only one working outlet in my room, next to the closet, and I needed to charge my phone. I looked up and saw what looked like a pair of glowing golden eyes that were like a pointed oval shape, and they slanted down towards the middle. They were huge. At first, I thought it was somehow a reflection of light, as I had my phone on and a nightlight plugged in the same outlet, so I unplugged it and turned my phone screen off. When I realized that it looked like eyes and wasn't a light reflection, I got up and ran out of my room immediately and banged on my grandparents' bedroom door. When I told them about it, they told me it was probably an animal. The thing is, our house was not directly on the ground, but it was propped up on tall stacks of bricks. It was a portable home. It was way too high for something like a bear, which I'm pretty sure doesn't have those types of eyes anyway. There was nothing that an owl could have been perched up on, and the eyes were way too big for that either. The eyes, for the short time I saw them before running out of my bedroom, were staring right at me, unblinkingly. To this day, I'll never sleep with my curtains open, and I still have no idea what that could have been. Does anyone have any ideas on what I saw that night? I have an encounter from my childhood that has stuck with me forever. It was such a strange experience. I don't really know what it was, or certain what happened, but I am 100% that I saw what I saw. I grew up in suburban Missouri, right around the St. Louis area. There was one summer night when I was 11 or 12 when I was out riding my bike with a friend in my neighborhood. We rode until 9 p.m., and at this point, it was just a little past dusk, so we headed back to my house. It wasn't pitch black since the sun had just set, so we could still see pretty well. My friend rode ahead of me, and because she wanted to call some other girl to have her come over, and I stayed back to pet a dog. The dog left, and I started riding my bike again, and I looked across the street and saw a chunky black humanoid figure that was maybe 10-ish feet tall, all black, and it was standing next to a ranch-style house, touching the branches on the tree next to it. I fell off my bike as soon as I saw it, but never felt scared or anything. I watched it for a couple of minutes, but it could have only been like 30 seconds. You know how dumb kids' brains work with time. As it was just looking at this tree, it was quiet and I never heard a sound come out of its mouth. And even if it took a step, I couldn't hear anything. It just decided to walk back into the small wooded area behind the house, and I never saw it again. It was an amazing experience, and I have such a positive emotion associated with it. I just have no clue what I saw that night. Let me first clarify that this was 4 years ago, when I was 15 on a muzzleloader's mule deer hunt in the far northeastern part of Utah, which contains some of the most remote and beautiful places in the state. I've been frequently in and out of this area, spreading in Summit County that cuts in and out of lower Wyoming, since before I can remember, including lots of hiking, backpacking, camping, hunting, and being involved in some of my grandfather's work. I am skeptical of things not proven by methods of science, but I don't deny all of those things. I find that it's impossible for science to know of all that is out there in our vast world. My grandfather is a recently retired biologist and former conservation officer for the state, and was a regional specialist and was over wildlife and habitat management for many years. He's taken everything from habitat management programs, which is like controlled fires to benefit areas, to quite literally wrangling moose to be transplanted and darting black bears. He has seen mountain lions, bears, birds of all kinds, small mammals, plants, and natural phenomena for a majority of his life, and he understands so much that many people, including myself, will never be able to even imagine. He's scientific, honest, straightforward, level-headed. He's agnostic and is not superstitious, and often used to, lovingly and respectfully, tease a certain CO who thinks certain Bigfoot, skinwalkers, and other beings exist. Other than that, his experience, he has never encountered an animal that he could not at least partially identify, other than the natural innate fear of being in close quarters with a bear, drunken and belligerent hunter, or incredibly potent tranquilizer medication. He's told me over and over he's never been terrified of an animal or experience like this, only curious or surprised. It was late September, and we were in a small camp by a lake in the high Uinta Mountains, hunting both grouse and mule deer with muzzleloaders. The camp was a small collection of men and women my grandfather had worked with over the years, as supervisor/biologist/CO, and these were people I grew up with. One of the women, a new wife to one of the guys, had shot a buck deer, injuring but not killing it immediately, and they had lost track of it. Devastated by the thought of wasting the animal, she returned to camp in the afternoon upset and concerned that the deer had run into an even more secluded area of the mountain, which was hard to reach from the trail that she had shot from, a place my grandfather was familiar with because it was such a pain in the ass to get to, with lots of deadfall and steep terrain. We volunteered to go in the late afternoon to search for the deer, following a scant blood trail that she had tracked for a while before getting fatigued and intimidated by the terrain. Because both my grandfather and I were in good shape and he was so familiar, it didn't seem like a big deal. Before we left, she mentioned hearing what she assumed was coyotes, which made her even more so concerned that if the deer died, they would ruin the meat and hide before she could harvest it. We took off in the early evening, expecting to be back within an hour or two after searching and having our guns with us, in case we found the animal still alive or came across another buck worth trying to harvest. It was steep in places, with lots and lots of deadfall of varying heights, making the hike slower and more tedious than we had hoped, making us understand the other hunters' fatigue. She had marked the blood trail with bright orange pieces on the trees, which we followed for maybe 20 minutes, and then got it hard to track. The sun was getting close to setting at this point, and we knew getting out would be just as long getting in. We had just about decided to stop when we found a spot near a fallen tree that looked like it had been recently bedded down in, followed with splatters of fairly fresh blood, and we continued for longer. When the sun had just about set and the light had faded from the trees, we removed the firing caps from our guns to make them now completely safe, as it was now illegal and irresponsible to hunt in such absence of decent light. My grandfather pulled out his large mag light flashlight from his pack, and I put in my headlamp to begin the hike back, using our GPS to find the trailhead. About 10 minutes on the way back, we started to hear more movement among the trees. It was normal for animals to start moving now that the sun had gone down, as animals would likely be starting to head towards the clearings for water or to graze in the safety of lower light. Small and distant sounds of crunching leaves, patterings of hooves, animals or small bits of movement in the trees from squirrels or birds were common and expected. We did not expect the deafening, disturbing sound we heard next, which vaguely and initially reminded me of a coyote howl. But by a few seconds in, it was unidentifiable, frightening, and human-like. It started with what sounded like a person screaming, but then got louder and more intense, with a screech quality to it, so unlike any coyote or any animal we have ever heard. Then was the almost chattering that came in between the shrieks, and the movement of trees became almost calculated, almost threatening. We stopped dead in our tracks, frozen as my grandfather started using the light to look around. I was far more freaked out than him at this point. He just seemed perplexed, curious, and a little baffled at what could make that sound. It sounded human, but with no words, with no urge of tone of help or I'm just screaming to mess with you. We continued on after it mostly stopped, and it seemed like the other, natural and distant sounds had gone almost silent. I listened intently to the sound of my boots crunching with the dry aspen leaves underfoot, trying to tell myself that it was just some weird coyote with a horrible deformed larynx or something. Maybe 20 minutes from the main trail that would lead us to the truck, we heard the chittering sound again and sounds of thumping against dead trees. Looking around with our lights, in between deadfall, maybe 12 to 15 feet in front of us, was a large human-looking thing. It was almost hunched down with a long, slender arm around the front of a standing aspen. The aspen, of course, was pale white, with the knots being dark brown, and whatever it was had skin almost as pale. I caught a very brief glimpse of its face. It seemed round and the eyes seemed sunken, and I cannot tell you eye color other than a flash of reflection on the eye from my light, and that its face seemed sunken and emaciated. I didn't see any fur or hair. I never felt like it looked right at me. More my grandfather, and just in our direction, almost confused and curious, like he was before with the sound. For a mere couple of seconds, I caught a glimpse of it, but that was it. I looked down at the ground, holding my eyes shut, trying to imagine being safe and secure in the truck, and my grandfather took a few stumbling steps backward toward me. I heard the thing go off to our side, moving quickly and with purpose through the trees, to the side and then dropped down behind us. I would assume according to the sound, of course, but I hope it went in the opposite direction. My grandfather turned to where it had veered off, as to follow it, but he soon stopped and looked at me. I had never before and never since seen him so confused, baffled, horrified, curious, and in awe. I was crying at this point, ugly crying, trying to muffle my shaking breath and voice, and I asked him, "What was that?" Over and over I asked, and he had no answer for me. He pulled his gun off his shoulder and put a cap back on the nipple of the igniter, making the gun live, and he then carried it in front of his body in his arm. He pulled out another headlight to put on himself. We started walking again towards the trail as he listed off like talking to himself as to what it wasn't. Things like, couldn't have been a deer, or elk, or moose. It had arms, it was hunched, it stood upright. Or, a bear? A very sick bear. It could have been a bear. Was it the light? We heard the sound, the screeching human howl distantly once more before reaching the trail, which was dirt and gravel, but fairly flat and no deadfall. We practically jogged to the truck. I locked the doors immediately and sobbed, and my grandfather turned on music as loud as possible to try and distract me on the way back to camp. I was a mess when we arrived back, and he went to talk with the others by the fire when he got me settled in my sleeping bag in my bunk. He explained to some of his friends, but I don't know what all was said. The next day, everyone was extra sweet to me, trying to comfort me and saying it was probably a sick animal that looked scary in the dark. The deer the hunter shot was found the next day, in the daylight, scavenged quite harshly by what I assume was coyotes. To this day, he has no clue what it was, nor what that sound was, And before and since, I've heard both coyote and many other animal sounds that never even compared to that sound. The scientist in me, and in him, the hopeful and blissfully ignorant people in us, hope and speculate it was just a deformed, sick animal in scant light. But I still have no clue what that thing was, and I hope I never experience it again. Oh, and to give a little extra detail before I forget, it seemed tall. It wasn't small in stature. Even though it was sort of hunched down and over, its torso and arms seemed long, and based on the length of arms, it had to be tall, or else its arms would be dragging length on the ground. It was bony. It truly looked emaciated, like an animal that hadn't eaten in a long time, or that was ill. Its skin looked anemic, and unlike a person, I couldn't tell much of a green or blue undertone in the arm or face that would sort of indicate superficial veins. It looked dehydrated. I don't remember getting a good look at its hands, but its arms were thin, as well as lanky. I don't remember seeing ears, and remember that its mouth was sort of small. I don't even think its mouth was open. Unlike a human, it didn't have lips or pigment to its cheeks. Its head was tilted slightly up, which is because I think my grandpa was slightly closer than I was. Its neck seemed longer than a human's, and the tendons of the neck seemed to be pretty obvious. Like if a thin person extended and flexed the neck, you can see the tendons and delicate musculature. Its eyes, they seemed sunken and set back, hollow almost. There was that very distinct flashback of light from its eyes, which is because of the thin membrane just behind animals' retinas. Humans do not have this biological feature. Once I saw it, I shortly after began crying because not only was I creeped out, but because of the sounds we had heard, and the fact that I felt my beloved grandfather and I were vulnerable to it, but because I was disturbed by how unfamiliar and unnatural it was. While in high school, I worked at a vet clinic as a veterinary technician and have seen sick animals, large and small. I've seen animals hit by cars. I've seen them cut up and torn up, anemic, infected with parasites or mange. I have worked on animals just before death, and I have seen animals dead. I've seen animals during necropsy, and have also seen wild animals hurt, dead, or sick. This was like all the weirdest and most disturbing attributes of a hurt, dead, or sick animal, sort of balled into one disturbing being. I think that is why I was so upset, because I could not have understood what it was, and how something so disturbingly dead and lifeless looking could be standing there looking at us, breathing and living and curious about us. I'm a person of science, like yourself it sounds like, so none of this made sense to me. Science is safety. Logic is safety. At least to me. If it was a black bear or elk or mountain lion, I would have known how to react. I would have known if it was dangerous. Honestly, I still hike and hunt up there, but when I think about it, it scares me half to death. A scared animal that felt cornered, trapped, threatened, or even territorial probably would have, and I think that given its stature, it would be able to at least scare us off and do minor damage if physically it felt threatened. The next point I want to make here is if it was predatory, it could have gone one or two ways. One, if it wanted to hunt, kill, or eat us, it could have attacked us and tried. Two, if it was predatory and wanted to hunt, kill, eat us, it could have decided not to because of many reasons. There were two of us. We weren't very small and we weren't injured. We had lights and a gun, or a weapon, or some sort of large protective object. We weren't what it typically goes after, or it had already been satisfied with a different animal. Look, obviously it didn't attack us, but both of the options are terrifying to me. We were in fact alone, secluded and without our weapons and lights, probably not too dangerous to it. This disturbs and horrifies me. But I also wonder if this thing is what so many others have seen. Why has nobody been hurt? I wish I could debunk, discredit, or even explain away what we saw that night, but I can't. So, I've been seeing this super tall and skinny thing in doorways and running in halls. It's like a white, fleshy color, and has rather sunken facial features. It seems to be more afraid of me than I am of it. Or maybe it just doesn't want to be caught. Or could it be something else? I've spent most nights not worrying about it, but it's showing up a lot more, almost braver each time. If anyone knows anything about it that could give me more insight so I could get some more detail, please say. I seen it again today and it paralyzed me in fear to the point of tears upon it holding a stare. I've declared that I know it's there and want it gone and that it's not welcome. It looks like the rake, no joke. My sister thinks it might be a skinwalker. I've read a bit about them and it worries me as to where it's coming from and where it goes. Also, why it's after me and no one else but me and my sister are seeing it. I'm posting on behalf of my boyfriend and 2 of his experiences and 1 of my own. A few years back, my boyfriend was on his job site and he called me late explaining that he had seen something that looked like it was trying to cloak itself but failing to. Kind of glitching in a way. It was near a hedge, and he told me he could clearly see the outline of what appeared to be a human figure. He said it was there, and then it was gone, almost as soon as he looked away. I have had reoccurring dreams of seeing through or mirror people that have become unsettling and stressful to the point I don't want to sleep, and this has only been happening recently, the last 2 months. They are basically the same. I'm in the river near my home, surrounded by these beings or creatures, and I feel very vulnerable and scared. It's so realistic, it's almost like a lucid dream, or an OBE. Very strange and happens weekly. The topping that made me want to post this is that last night, my boyfriend had seen this very weird translucent thing again, after years of not seeing it or even thinking of it. Now, I haven't told him about my dreams, and still don't plan to, just as of yet. And I find this timing to be so odd and a bit frightening. I'm a huge believer in almost all otherworldly things, so I am a little bit on edge. He said it was by our back hedge against the fence, and there was a clear outline of where it was standing. He said it glimmered and its body kind of waved. He described it as looking at a reflection of our hedge in the water. He has been backing up slowly from it, and when he glanced away for a second, it was gone. He then came into the room and woke me up, and I'll admit, he looked really concerned and a bit terrified. He's not really one to believe in these things. Has anyone had any experiences or have heard such things? I found one article with a Google search of a few witness accounts of almost identical creatures, but nothing truly substantial. I'm very curious about this and am dying to figure out what it could be.